The rain in Northern Virginia didn't fall, it surrendered. It beat against the windowpanes of Deborah Fisher's modest suburban home like a desperate fugitive begging to be let in. Inside, the house smelled of lavender baby lotion and stale coffee, the universal perfume of single motherhood. Deborah stood in the doorway of the small bedroom, her shoulder leaning against the doorframe. She watched the gentle rise and fall of her 6-year-old daughter's chest. Ivy was fast asleep, her small fingers tightly clutching a stuffed golden retriever that had seen better days. Ivy had his nose, she had his stubborn chin, and in the rare moments when she laughed loudly enough to shake the walls, she had his exact, crooked smile. Deborah swallowed hard, forcing down the familiar, jagged lump in her throat. 5 years. Today marked exactly 5 years. 5 years since the knock on the door. 5 years since 2 men in crisp class A uniforms stood on her porch. Their faces carved from stone, holding a folded American flag. 5 years since Army Ranger Luke Fisher was declared killed in action during a classified off-the-books operation in the unforgiving mountains of the Helmand province. They had told her it was an IED. They had told her he didn't suffer. They had told her a lot of things. Deborah, a former military intelligence officer herself, knew that half of it was heavily redacted bullshit. But grief had a way of suffocating the questions before they could be asked. She quietly pulled the bedroom door shut, leaving it cracked just an inch. Old habits died hard. A good soldier never completely seals their primary exit. Walking down the narrow hallway, Deborah's bare feet moved silently over the hardwood floor. At 32, she was lean, a little too pale, and her eyes, a striking, icy blue, always seemed to be scanning the perimeter. Even in her own living room, the physical scars from her own tours in the Middle East were hidden beneath her oversized gray sweater. But the invisible ones dictated her life. The hypervigilance, the insomnia, the way she instinctively noted the make, model, and license plate of every car parked on her street. She reached the kitchen, poured the last 2 fingers of a cheap Cabernet into a glass, and sat at the island counter. On the table sat a heavy, fireproof lockbox. She only took it out once a year. Today, with a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, Deborah punched in the code, 0814. Ivy's birthday. The heavy lid popped open. Inside, there was a stack of handwritten letters bound by a rubber band. Luke's dog tags, a silver Zippo lighter, and an old, bulky satellite phone. It was an encrypted burner, a relic from their days deployed in the sandbox. They used to use it for unauthorized, encrypted texts when they were stationed on different bases. Just in case the world ends and I need to tell you I love you. Luke had joked when he gave it to her. It hadn't been turned on in 5 years. The battery had been dead since the day he was lowered into the ground at Arlington National Cemetery. Deborah picked up the cold, black plastic device. Her thumb traced the worn buttons. She didn't know why, but a masochistic urge washed over her. She grabbed the proprietary charging cable from the bottom of the box, plugged it into the wall, and connected the phone. A tiny, red LED light flickered to life. Charging. I miss you, you stubborn bastard, she whispered to the empty room. Taking a slow sip of the wine. Ivy drew a picture of you today. She gave you purple hair. You would have hated it. She smiled, a bitter, broken thing, and let the tears finally come. They fell silently, tracking down her cheeks and dropping onto the cold granite countertop. She allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of weakness. That was the rule. 3 minutes to be a grieving widow. And then she had to go back to being a mother. She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, stood up, and moved to the sink to wash her glass. Then, it happened. A sound that froze the blood in her veins and made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. Deborah dropped the wine glass. It shattered against the stainless steel sink, spraying crimson droplets across the counter. She didn't flinch. She didn't breathe. She turned slowly. The old satellite phone was vibrating on the island, its small monochrome screen glowing with a harsh green light. No, her mind screamed. Impossible. It's a glitch. It's spam. It's a recycling of old phone numbers. But this wasn't a standard cellular network. This was a direct, point-to-point encrypted frequency. To send a message to this device, someone would need the exact decryption key. A key only 2 people in the world possessed. And one of them was dead. Her legs felt like lead. But years of combat training took over. Deborah approached the table with the cautious precision of someone disarming a bomb. She stared down at the screen. One new message. Sender. Unknown. Her trembling finger hovered over the "Read" button. She pressed it. The text on the small green screen read, "Greater than the porch light is flickering. Deb, tell Ivy purple is my favorite color. They lied about Helmand. I am compromised. Do not trust the agency. Run." The air was violently sucked out of the room. Deborah gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white, the world tilted on its axis. The porch light is flickering. It was their old code word from their deployment in Syria. It meant, I am in immediate, mortal danger and coming in hot. And the purple hair. Ivy had drawn that picture 2 hours ago. At the kitchen table, with the blinds drawn. He's alive. The thought hit her like a physical blow. Luke is alive, and he's watching the house. But before the joy, before the shock could fully register, the chilling reality of the last sentence sank its claws into her spine. Do not trust the agency. Run. Suddenly, the mundane sounds of the rainy night shifted. To the untrained ear, it was just the storm. But to Deborah Fisher, it was a symphony of tactical movement. The subtle crunch of wet gravel in the driveway. The metallic click of a silenced weapon brushing against a tactical vest outside her kitchen window. The complete, unnatural silence of the neighborhood dogs. They were here. In a fraction of a second, the grieving widow vanished. The exhausted single mother disappeared. In her place stood Captain Deborah Fisher. U.S. Army intelligence. Cold, calculating, lethal. She ripped the charging cable from the wall and shoved the satellite phone into her pocket. She didn't run. Running made noise. She glided into the hallway, her hand instinctively reaching behind the family portrait on the wall. She pressed a hidden latch. The drywall popped open, revealing a biometric safe. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. Beep. The door sprang open. Inside rested a fully loaded Glock 19 with a threaded barrel, 2 spare magazines, a tactical flashlight, and a stack of untraceable cash. She grabbed the weapon, racking the slide with a fluid, practiced motion. The chambering of the 9mm round was a loud, aggressive sound in the quiet house. Time to wake up, Ivy, Deborah whispered to herself, her eyes hardening into steel. She moved rapidly toward her daughter's room. Through the crack in the blinds, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the front yard. For a split second, she saw them, 3 men in black tactical gear, moving in a stack formation toward her front door. They weren't cops. They weren't local SWAT. The way they moved, the absence of insignias, these were ghosts. Cleaners. The kind of men the CIA sent when a problem needed to be buried forever. They were coming for her. They were coming for Ivy. Deborah kicked Ivy's door open and rushed to the bed. She scooped the sleepy, confused 6-year-old into her arms, pressing a hand gently but firmly over the child's mouth. "Shush, baby bird," Deborah whispered directly into Ivy's ear, her tone completely even, betraying zero panic. "We're going to play the quiet game now. We're going on a night adventure." Ivy blinked, her sleepy eyes wide, clutching her stuffed dog. She nodded slowly against her mother's hand. Down the hall, the heavy oak front door groaned as a lock-picking tool slid into the deadbolt. Click. Deborah backed toward the bedroom window. Her Glock raised, the cold rain pounding against the glass behind her. 5 years ago, she had lost her world. Tonight, whoever these men were, whatever conspiracy they were part of, they were about to find out exactly why Luke Fisher had married her. They thought they were hunting a widow. They were about to walk into a lion's den. The front door kicked open with a deafening crash. "Execute," a muffled voice commanded from the hallway. Deborah held her breath, wrapped one arm tightly around her daughter, raised her weapon, and stepped into the shadows. The heavy oak door splintered inward, the deadbolt tearing cleanly through the doorframe. To Deborah, the crash seemed to happen in slow motion, a jarring bass drop that shook the floorboards beneath her feet. "Clear the living room. Move, move," a low, gravelly voice ordered. The sound was muffled by a heavy tactical mask, but the intent was crystal clear. 3 pairs of heavy boots swept onto the hardwood. They moved with terrifying, synchronized fluidity. No shouting, no flashbangs. They didn't want to wake the neighbors, they wanted a localized, silent execution. In the pitch-black bedroom, Deborah stood pressed against the wall beside the open doorframe, the Glock 19 heavy and steady in her right hand. Her left arm was wrapped like a vice around Ivy, pinning the child's face to her chest. Ivy was trembling, a violent, full-body shake, but she didn't make a sound. She was playing the quiet game. Through the crack in the door, a narrow beam of a weapon-mounted light sliced through the darkness of the hallway. Sweeping methodically left to right, it was creeping closer to Ivy's room. 12 feet away, Deborah calculated, listening to the compression of the floorboards. 10 feet. 8. She didn't wait for the intruder to breach the doorway. In close-quarters combat, action always beats reaction. Using her knowledge of her own home's architecture, Deborah visualized the target through the thin dry wall of the hallway. She took a half-breath, anchored her stance, and squeezed the trigger. Pop pop. The suppressed 9mm sneezed twice. The hollow point rounds punched effortlessly through the plaster and studs, exactly at upper chest height. A heavy grunt echoed in the hall, followed by the chaotic clatter of a heavy rifle hitting the floor, and a body crashing against the wall. "Contact. Left side," a second voice hissed. A suppressed submachine gun immediately opened fire, shredding the dry wall where Deborah had been standing a microsecond before. Plaster dust and splinters exploded into the bedroom, raining down on them like deadly snow. But Deborah was already moving. She spun away from the door, lunging toward the bedroom window. She shoved the Glock into the waistband of her sweatpants, grabbed the heavy wooden desk chair with her free hand, and hurled it through the glass. The window shattered outward in a spectacular explosion of glass and rain. The alarm system didn't beep. They had cut the hard lines outside. Professionals. Hold on tight. Baby bird, Deborah whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. Without hesitating, she threw her leg over the sill and vaulted out into the torrential storm. Clutching her daughter to her chest, they dropped 6 feet, landing with a wet thud in the muddy azalea bushes below. The jagged edge of the broken window frame sliced a deep gash into Deborah's shoulder. But the adrenaline surging through her veins muted the pain to a dull throb. "Target is mobile. Out the side window," a voice yelled from inside the bedroom. Beam lights immediately swept the backyard. "Keep your eyes closed, Ivy," Deborah commanded softly, scrambling to her feet in the slick mud. The cold Virginia rain was a blessing. It severely reduced visibility and washed away the thermal signatures their night vision goggles relied on. Deborah sprinted across the flooded lawn, her bare feet slipping in the wet grass, making a beeline for the thick line of oak trees that bordered the property. Mud splattered against her legs. Her lungs burned. Every instinct screamed at her to look back, to check her six, but she knew that turning her head would slow her down. A bullet whizzed past her ear, a high-pitched supersonic crack, and embedded itself into the trunk of an oak tree just inches from her face. She dove into the tree line, immediately using the heavy, wet foliage as concealment. She dropped into a low crouch behind a massive rotting log, wrapping her body around Ivy like a human shield. She drew her Glock again, wiping the rain from her eyes, and aimed back at her house. Through the pouring rain, 2 dark silhouettes vaulted through the shattered bedroom window, landing smoothly in the yard. Their rifles were raised, green laser sights cutting through the sheets of rain, scanning the tree line. 2 left, Deborah thought, her mind a cold, calculating machine, 1 wounded or dead in the hall. She pressed a finger to Ivy's lips. The little girl nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her pale cheeks. She was clutching her stuffed golden retriever so tightly her knuckles were white. "You're doing so good, my brave girl," Deborah breathed into her ear. The 2 operatives began to advance slowly across the yard, fanning out to flank her position. They were using the storm's noise to mask their approach, communicating only with silent hand signals. Deborah needed a distraction. She couldn't take them both in an open firefight while holding a child. She reached into her pocket with her left hand, her fingers brushing against Luke's heavy satellite phone. The screen was still glowing faintly. "The porch light is flickering. Deb." An idea sparked. It was risky. It was desperate. It was all she had. She took a deep breath, shifted her weight, and threw the bulky satellite phone as hard as she could toward a metal shed 20 yards to her left. The heavy plastic device clattered loudly against the corrugated steel siding of the shed. Instantly, both operatives pivoted, their green lasers converging on the sound. For a fraction of a second, they broke their cover, their attention entirely focused on the shed. It was the only opening Deborah was going to get. She stood up from behind the log, leveled her weapon, and fired 3 rapid shots. Center mass. Head. Center mass. The operative on the right dropped like a stone, eliminated before he even realized he was in the crosshairs. The remaining operative spun back, firing a wild burst into the trees. Bark exploded around Deborah. She dropped back down, shielding Ivy as the mud erupted around them. "Tango down. I need backup," the surviving cleaner shouted into his comms, abandoning stealth. Deborah didn't wait for him to reload or regroup. She knew the golden rule of a firefight: speed and aggression. She broke cover from the left, using the darkness, flanking him while he was still aiming at her last known position. She closed the distance in 3 terrifying strides. Before he could track her movement, she was within arm's reach. She slapped the barrel of his rifle away with her left forearm and drove the muzzle of her Glock directly up under the heavy Kevlar rim of his helmet. She pulled the trigger once. The operative collapsed backward into the mud, his rifle falling from his limp hands. The yard fell deathly silent, save for the relentless drum of the rain. 3 dead men, her home violated, her sanctuary destroyed. Deborah stood over the fallen operative, her chest heaving, the rain washing the blood and mud from her face. She looked down at the man. No unit patches, no dog tags, sterile gear. She quickly knelt and rifled through his tactical vest. She found what she was looking for: a set of car keys with a black, unmarked fob. She hurried back to the metal shed and retrieved Luke's satellite phone from the mud. The screen was cracked, but the green light was still on. The message was still there. Run. She picked Ivy up, hoisting the soaked, shivering child onto her hip. Are the bad men gone, Mommy? Ivy whispered, her voice raspy and terrified. They're gone, sweetie. I've got you, Deborah said, her voice tight but reassuring. We're going to take a ride now. She moved swiftly through the neighbor's yard, keeping to the shadows, until she reached the cul-de-sac. Parked illegally by the fire hydrant was a massive, black, unmarked Chevy Suburban, the cleaner's transport. Deborah hit the unlock button on the fob. The SUV chirped twice. She opened the rear door, strapped Ivy into the backseat, and threw a heavy tactical fleece she found in the trunk over the shivering child. Climbing into the driver's seat, she hit the ignition. The powerful V8 engine roared to life. As she pulled out of the neighborhood, leaving her shattered life behind in the rearview mirror, Deborah glanced down at the cracked satellite phone resting in the center console. 5 years ago, she buried an empty casket. She mourned a ghost. She built a new life from the ashes. But Luke wasn't a ghost. He was out there. He was hunted. And now, so was she. She gripped the steering wheel, her icy blue eyes hardening into a terrifying resolve. The CIA wanted to send cleaners to her house? They wanted to threaten her little girl? They had made a fatal miscalculation. They woke up the wrong widow. The heavy Chevy Suburban tore through the rain-slicked streets of suburban Virginia like a black leviathan. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the rhythmic, frantic slapping of the windshield wipers and the deep, throaty hum of the V8 engine. Deborah's knuckles were bone white on the leather steering wheel. The adrenaline spike that had propelled her out of the house was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, shivering reality, and pain. A hot, searing pain radiated from the deep gash on her left shoulder where the broken window frame had bitten into her flesh. She could feel the warm, sticky blood soaking through her heavy cotton sweater, pooling uncomfortably against her skin. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Ivy was curled into a tight ball on the massive leather backseat, buried beneath the tactical fleece. The little girl's eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. She wasn't crying anymore. That worried Deborah more than the tears. It was shock. "Hey, baby bird," Deborah called out softly, keeping her eyes scanning the dark road ahead. "You still with me?" Ivy blinked slowly. "Are we going to see Daddy?" The question hit Deborah harder than a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the cracked black satellite phone resting in the cup holder. The porch light is flickering. Deb. I don't know. Ivy. Deborah answered honestly, her voice thick with emotion. But we're going to find out. I promise you. She needed to get off the main roads. The local police would be swarming her house soon, triggered by the neighbors or the gunshot reports. And the CIA, or whoever these ghosts worked for, would be looking for their missing strike team and this very vehicle. Spotting a decaying sign for an abandoned strip mall, Deborah jerked the steering wheel, guiding the heavy SUV behind a dilapidated, graffiti-covered supermarket. It was dark, shielded from the main road by overgrown pines, and completely deserted. She slammed the gearshift into park and killed the engine, but left the battery running to keep the heat blasting for Ivy. Stay right here. Don't unbuckle, Deborah instructed, unholstering her Glock. She stepped out into the freezing rain. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony radiating from her shoulder. Ignoring it, she moved quickly to the rear of the Suburban, popping the trunk. If these men were professionals, they brought toys, and Deborah needed toys. The trunk was a treasure trove of unauthorized violence. Inside lay 2 heavy Pelican cases. She snapped the latches open. The first contained a suppressed MP7 submachine gun, spare magazines, and a row of flashbang grenades. She slung the MP7 over her good shoulder. The second case held exactly what she was praying for, a high-tiered trauma kit. She grabbed the medical bag and climbed into the backseat next to Ivy. Close your eyes, sweetie. Mommy has to do some first aid, Deborah said, her teeth gritted. She ripped open her bloody sweater, exposing the jagged laceration. It was deep, but thankfully, it hadn't hit an artery. With practiced, brutal efficiency, she poured a bottle of sterile saline over the wound, biting down hard on her bottom lip to suppress a scream. The coppery smell of blood filled the confined space. She quickly packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, applied a pressure dressing, and wrapped it tight with medical tape. It wasn't pretty, but it would stop the bleeding. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she turned her attention to the front cabin. She needed intel. Who sent them? How did they find her so fast? She rifled through the glove compartment. Nothing but vehicle registration under a shell company, Apex Logistics, LLC, a dead end. She checked the center console. Beneath a stack of fast food napkins, her fingers brushed against cold metal. A tactical tablet. She pulled it out. The screen was dark, requiring a biometric fingerprint or a complex passcode. Useless without the dead operative's hand. But beneath the tablet was a simple, old-school spiral notepad and a burner phone. Deborah flipped the notepad open. Most of it was blank, but the first page had 3 lines hastily scrawled in black ink. Target: Echo Actual, Spouse. Lock: 412 Sycamore Drive. Objective: sanitize. Recover the asset. Deborah stared at the words. Echo Actual. That was Luke's call sign in Helmand. They weren't just here to kill her. They were here to recover the asset. What asset? Suddenly, the burner phone in her hand vibrated violently. Deborah froze. The screen lit up with an incoming text message from an unknown number. Greater than sitrep. Is the widow neutralized? Deborah's heart hammered against her ribs. They were checking in. If she didn't answer, they would know the team was compromised. But if she answered wrong, she'd give herself away. Before she could type a response, a sharp, rhythmic beep echoed from the dashboard. Beep. Beep, beep. Deborah's blood ran cold. She knew that sound. She dropped the burner phone and scrambled toward the dashboard, her eyes frantically searching the steering column, the air vents, the underside of the console. Damn it. No, 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 she muttered, her fingers tearing at the plastic paneling under the steering wheel. There, tucked deep behind the wiring harness, a small black box with a blinking red LED light. A real-time GPS transponder. The hit team didn't just have radios. Overwatch was tracking the vehicle's exact location. They knew the SUV had stopped. They knew it wasn't at the target house. Ivy, Deborah snapped, her voice leaving no room for argument. We have to go. Right now. But it's raining. Mommy, the little girl whimpered, clutching her stuffed dog. I know, baby, I know, but we can't stay in this car. Deborah grabbed the trauma kit, the MP7, and Luke's satellite phone, stuffing them into a canvas duffel bag she found in the trunk. She reached under the dash and brutally ripped the GPS transponder from its wiring. The red light kept blinking, it had an internal battery. She hauled Ivy out of the SUV into the freezing downpour. Looking around frantically, she heard the distant, heavy rumble of an 18-wheeler air braking on the interstate overpass above them. Come on, Deborah urged, pulling her daughter toward the muddy embankment leading up to the highway. She scrambled up the slick, grassy slope, her boots slipping, her wounded shoulder screaming in protest. She reached the guardrail just as a massive, long-haul freight truck slowed down due to the heavy rain, crawling at a mere 10 miles per hour in the right lane. With a fierce grunt, Deborah leaned over the wet metal guardrail. As the truck's massive rear trailer rumbled past, she slammed the magnetic GPS tracker hard against the steel bumper. It stuck fast. She slid back down the muddy embankment, pulling Ivy into the deep shadows of the tree line as the truck accelerated, carrying the CIA's tracking signal straight down I-95. Hundreds of miles away from them. Deborah leaned against a wet pine tree, gasping for air, her arm wrapped protectively around her shivering daughter. She looked down at the burner phone she had stolen from the hit squad. She thumbed the screen and typed a reply to the handler's message. Greater than the widow is gone. Tell your boss she's coming for him. She hit send, pulled the battery out of the phone, and tossed it into a puddle. She had no car. She was bleeding. She had a 6-year-old in tow. And she was officially at war with the United States' most powerful intelligence agency. Okay, Luke, she whispered to the stormy night, touching the old satellite phone in her pocket. I'm running. Now tell me where to go. The rain had turned from a torrential downpour into a freezing, relentless mist that clung to everything it touched. Under the concrete belly of the I-95 overpass, the world smelled of wet asphalt, diesel exhaust, and decay. Deborah leaned against a graffitied concrete pylon, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes. Her left arm was practically useless, throbbing with a dull, heavy heat that warned her the adrenaline was completely gone. She had wrapped her oversized tactical fleece around Ivy, turning the little girl into a shivering, shapeless bundle. Mommy, my feet are like ice, Ivy whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the highway above them. Deborah knelt, ignoring the sharp stab in her shoulder, and pulled Ivy into a tight embrace. She rubbed her daughter's small, freezing hands between her own blood-stained palms. I know, baby bird, I know, just a little longer, Deborah murmured, pressing a kiss to Ivy's damp forehead. "You remember Uncle Marcus?" Ivy sniffled, thinking for a moment. "The big man who smells like cigars and motor oil." "Yeah, exactly." Deborah managed a weak, fractured smile. "We're going to go see him. He's going to help us get warm." Marcus Vance. Call sign: Grizzly. He was the heavy weapons specialist in Luke's old Ranger unit. Long before Luke got recruited into the agency's Black Ops division, Marcus had caught shrapnel in his knee during a dust-up in Fallujah and was honorably discharged. Now, he ran a custom auto body shop in Alexandria, a legitimate front for a highly illegal underground logistics network. If you needed a clean car, a scrubbed passport, or a ghost flight out of the country, Marcus was the man you called. But calling him was dangerous. The agency monitored all known associates of burned assets. If Deborah used a regular phone, a drone would be orbiting Marcus's shop before she even hung up. She reached into the canvas duffel bag and pulled out the old satellite phone. The battery icon was flashing red. 15%. She couldn't call Marcus directly. She had to use the burner protocol, a distress system she and Luke had established years ago. Just in case the worst ever happened. Leaving Ivy tucked in the driest corner of the underpass, Deborah stepped out into the freezing mist. She walked 100 yards down the frontage road until she found what she was looking for, a decaying, neon-lit strip mall with a rusted payphone attached to a shuttered laundromat. A relic from a forgotten decade. She dropped a handful of wet quarters she'd scavenged from the stolen SUV into the slot. She didn't dial Marcus's number. Instead, she dialed a local 1-800 number for a generic automated weather service in Chicago. When the robotic voice began reading the forecast, Deborah rapidly punched in a 9-digit sequence on the keypad. The line clicked. The weather forecast vanished, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum. "This line is unmonitored," a gruff, synthesized voice stated automatically. "Leave a message at the tone." Beep. Deborah closed her eyes, fighting the tremor in her voice. "The sky is falling in Virginia. Need an umbrella. 2 blocks south of the Route 1 overpass. Bring heat." She hung up the receiver, wiping the rain from her face. It was a blind drop. She had no way of knowing if Marcus still monitored that line, or if he would even come. In this life, 5 years was an eternity. Loyalties expired. People moved on. She hurried back to the underpass. Ivy had fallen asleep, her tiny body curled around the stuffed golden retriever, trembling violently in the cold. Deborah pulled the suppressed MP7 submachine gun from the duffel bag, checked the chamber, and sat on the cold concrete beside her daughter. And then, she waited. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. The cold was seeping into her bones. Her eyelids grew heavy, the exhaustion of the night threatening to drag her under. Suddenly, a pair of headlights swept across the wet pavement of the frontage road. Deborah instantly snapped awake. She positioned her body between the approaching vehicle and Ivy, raising the muzzle of the MP7, resting it on her bent knee. A rusted, beat-up Ford F-150 rolled to a stop 50 feet away. The engine idled with a rough, uneven growl. The headlights cut off, plunging the area back into darkness. Deborah didn't move. She kept her finger resting just outside the trigger guard. The driver's side door creaked open. A massive, towering silhouette stepped out into the mist. He wore a heavy Carhartt jacket and a worn-out baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't carry a visible weapon. but his hands were kept strictly away from his body, palms open and facing forward. "That's a nasty habit, Deb," pointing German engineering at old friends. A deep, gravelly voice echoed through the underpass. Deborah exhaled a long, shaky breath she didn't realize she was holding. She lowered the weapon but didn't safety it. "It's a nasty world, Marcus," she replied, her voice hoarse. Marcus walked slowly toward them, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the instinct of a seasoned combat veteran. When his gaze fell upon Deborah, soaked in mud, bleeding heavily from her shoulder, holding a submachine gun over her sleeping child, his stoic expression cracked. "Jesus Christ, Deb," he muttered, closing the distance quickly. He knelt beside her, his massive hands gently touching her uninjured shoulder. "Who did this? Who's hunting you?" "I don't know," Deborah lied. She couldn't tell him about the CIA yet. She couldn't drag him into treason without warning. "A hit squad. 3 men. They breached the house. I handled it." Marcus let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "3 pros? And you walked away? Remind me never to piss you off." He looked down at Ivy, his expression softening instantly. "Is the little bird okay?" "She's freezing. Marcus, we need to get off the street." "Truck's warm. Let's move." Marcus scooped the sleeping Ivy into his massive arms as effortlessly as if she weighed nothing at all. He wrapped his heavy, dry jacket around her. Deborah grabbed the duffel bag. Struggling to stand, Marcus extended a hand and pulled her to her feet, supporting her weight as they hurried to the truck. Once inside the cab of the F-150, the blast of the heater felt like heaven. Deborah slumped against the cracked leather seat, the tension finally breaking. Ivy remained asleep, safely nestled between them on the bench seat. Marcus threw the truck into gear and pulled back onto the deserted road, checking his mirrors obsessively. "You got a tail?" he asked, his voice deadpan. "Scrubbed it," Deborah replied, pulled their GPS and stuck it to an 18-wheeler heading south. Marcus let out a dry chuckle. Classic Echo 2 maneuver. "God, I missed you, Deb." They drove in silence for a few miles, winding through the back roads of Alexandria. The hypnotic rhythm of the windshield wipers almost lulled Deborah to sleep. "So," Marcus said quietly, breaking the silence. His eyes were fixed on the dark road ahead. "You want to tell me why a highly trained hit squad just tried to wipe out the widow of an American war hero? You haven't been active in 5 years." Deborah stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. Her hand instinctively drifted to the pocket containing the satellite phone. "Marcus," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you know about Luke's final mission?" The atmosphere in the cab instantly shifted. The casual warmth evaporated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles cracked. "Operation Sandstorm," Marcus said flatly. "It was off the books. Highly classified. They went into Helmand to extract a high-value target. An IED hit the convoy. No survivors. Closed casket. You know the official story." "Deb." "I know the official story." Deborah pressed, turning to look at him. "I'm asking what you know." Marcus didn't answer right away. He took a sharp right turn down a narrow, unlit alleyway, finally pulling up to a large, unmarked corrugated steel garage door. He pressed a button on his visor, and the door rattled open, revealing a massive, dimly lit auto shop filled with half-assembled classic cars. He drove the truck inside. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind them. locking them in. Marcus killed the engine. In the quiet of the garage, he finally turned to look at Deborah. His face was a mask of grim reluctance. "Deb," Marcus said heavily. "The night before Luke deployed, he came to see me." Deborah's heart stopped. "What?" "He brought me a lockbox. Told me to bury it. Said if he didn't come back, I was to leave it buried for exactly 5 years." Marcus swallowed hard. He said the agency had a mole. A high-ranking leak. He said Operation Sandstorm wasn't an extraction. Deborah felt the blood drain from her face. Then what was it? Marcus looked her dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It was an assassination, and the target was Luke. The air inside Marcus's garage was thick with the scent of motor oil, old rubber, and dust, a stark, comforting contrast to the smell of blood and rain. The massive space was a graveyard of classic cars in various states of resurrection. Marcus led Deborah past the rusted skeleton of a '69 Mustang to a cluttered workbench at the far end of the shop. He didn't turn on the overhead fluorescents, opting instead for a single, low-wattage work lamp. He gently laid the sleeping Ivy on a dilapidated leather sofa in the corner, throwing a heavy wool blanket over her. Deborah stood rigidly by the workbench, her left arm held tightly against her chest. The throbbing in her shoulder was a constant, blinding metronome, but her mind was entirely focused on the bombshell Marcus had just dropped. An assassination. "Show me," Deborah demanded, her voice hollow. Marcus didn't argue. He grabbed a heavy crowbar from the wall and walked over to a seemingly unremarkable section of the concrete floor beneath the workbench. He wedged the steel bar into a hairline crack in the concrete and heaved. A heavy, concealed trapdoor popped open with a grinding groan. He reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a dirt-caked, military-grade lockbox. It was identical to the one Deborah kept in her kitchen, the one that held Luke's dog tags. Marcus set it on the workbench. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. He came to the shop at 0200 hours, the night before his unit shipped out. Marcus said quietly, staring at the box. He looked haunted. "Deb, I'd never seen him like that. Not in Ramadi. Not in Fallujah. He gave me the box and said, 'If you hear I went down in the sand, you wait exactly 5 years. Then, you open it.' Why 5 years? He said it would take that long for the dust to settle. For the people watching you to get sloppy." Deborah stepped closer, her trembling hand reaching out to touch the cold steel. There was a biometric thumb scanner on the latch. "It's coded to you, Deb," Marcus said, stepping back. "He made me swear I wouldn't try to open it." Deborah took a shaky breath. She pressed her right thumb against the glass scanner. The machine whirred softly. A green light flashed, and the heavy latches clicked open with a metallic clack. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of custom-cut foam, was a sleek, encrypted hard drive, a stack of offshore bank account ledgers, and a single, sealed white envelope. Written on the front of the envelope, in Luke's unmistakable, messy scrawl, was one word: Echo. A jagged sob caught in Deborah's throat. Seeing his handwriting, the sharp angles of the letters, the heavy pressure of the pen, made him more real in that moment than he had been in half a decade. She picked up the envelope, her hands shaking violently. She tore it open and pulled out 2 folded sheets of notebook paper. She read the words, and instantly, Luke's deep, steady voice echoed in her mind. "Deb, if you're reading this, it means the worst happened. It means I'm a ghost. And Marcus kept his promise. I don't have much time. I found something. Deb. Something rotting at the very core of the agency. 3 weeks ago, my team intercepted a shipment of weapons-grade nerve agent heading into Damascus. But the buyer wasn't a terrorist cell. The money trail traced back to a series of shell companies controlled by our own people. Specifically, Deputy Director Arthur Sterling. Deborah's breath hitched. Arthur Sterling, the man who had stood in her living room, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, handing her a folded flag and telling her how bravely her husband had died. She forced her eyes back to the letter. Sterling is running a shadow cartel from inside Langley. He's funding unauthorized black ops by selling confiscated weapons to the highest bidder. I compiled the evidence on the hard drive in this box. But Sterling knows I have it. He knows I pulled the thread. Operation Sandstorm isn't a rescue op. It's a trap. He's sending my unit into a kill box in Helmand. And he's going to use local insurgents to sanitize the mess. You're probably asking why I didn't just blow the whistle. Why I didn't go to the oversight committee. Because Sterling threatened the only things in this world that matter to me. He made it clear that if I went public, or if I suddenly disappeared, he would send his cleaners to our house. He would kill you, Deb, and he would kill Ivy. Tears were streaming freely down Deborah's face now, blurring the blue ink on the page. So, I have to walk into the trap. I have to let them think they won. I have to die in that desert so that you and Ivy can live in the light. I have a plan to get out. To go underground, but I can never contact you. If they even suspect I survived, they will come for you immediately. I am so sorry. My love, I'm sorry I won't be there to see Ivy grow up. I'm sorry I leave you with this burden. The money in the ledgers is clean. Take it, keep her safe, forget about me. But, if 5 years have passed, and you're reading this, it means Sterling has let his guard down. The hard drive contains everything you need to burn his empire to the ground. I love you, Deb, in this life. And whatever comes next. Luke. Deborah slowly lowered the letter. The silence in the garage was deafening. The sheer magnitude of Luke's sacrifice washed over her. A crushing wave of grief and furious, blinding rage. He had walked into his own execution. Lived as a hunted ghost in the shadows for 5 years. Completely isolated from the family he loved. Just to keep them breathing. And Sterling had stood in her house. He had patted Ivy's head. Deb? Marcus asked gently, stepping forward. What is it? It was Sterling, Deborah whispered, her voice colder than the ice outside. She looked up, her blue eyes devoid of tears, replaced by a terrifying, predatory calm. Deputy Director Arthur Sterling set them up. He slaughtered Luke's unit to cover up a treasonous weapons ring. Marcus's jaw tightened. The massive mechanic closed his eyes, his fists clenching at his sides. That son of a bitch. Luke is alive, Marcus, Deborah stated flatly. Marcus's eyes snapped open. What? Deb, that's impossible. We buried a casket. He texted me tonight on the old encrypted burner. That's why the hit squad came to my house. Sterling must have finally intercepted Luke's signal. He realized Luke was alive. Which means the threat is active again. Sterling sent the cleaners to wipe us out before Luke could make a move. Deborah turned to the workbench. She picked up the encrypted hard drive, her fingers curling tightly around the cool metal. For 5 years, she had been a victim of circumstance. A grieving widow. A civilian playing house while her husband's murderers sat in air-conditioned offices in Langley. That ended tonight. Marcus, Deborah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a combat officer. I need your shop's medical kit. I need a needle and heavy nylon thread. And I need a clean vehicle. Marcus looked at her, seeing the lethal operative that had been dormant for half a decade finally awaken. He nodded slowly. Where are we going? We aren't going anywhere, Deborah corrected, grabbing the submachine gun from the table. You're going to stay here and guard my daughter with your life. You lock this place down. Nobody gets in. And what the hell are you going to do? Deborah slipped the hard drive into her pocket and looked out toward the steel garage door. Toward the storm raging in the dark. Sterling sent a hit squad to my house, she said, chambering around into the MP7. I'm going to return the favor. The fluorescent light in the garage's small, grimy bathroom flickered, casting harsh, moving shadows against the peeling yellow wallpaper. Deborah stood in front of the cracked mirror over the sink. She had stripped off the blood-soaked tactical fleece and her ruined sweater, leaving her in just a black sports bra. Her pale skin was bruised, smeared with mud, and painted with dried blood. She stared at her own reflection. The exhaustion in her icy blue eyes was gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollow void. The woman in the mirror wasn't Ivy's mother anymore. She was Captain Fisher, Echo 2, a weapon that had been left in its scabbard for far too long. On the porcelain sink, she had laid out her supplies from Marcus's heavy-duty trauma kit, a bottle of generic rubbing alcohol, a curved surgical needle, heavy black nylon suture thread, and a clean towel. She uncapped the rubbing alcohol with her teeth, spit the cap into the sink, and took a deep breath. Without giving herself a second to hesitate, she poured the clear liquid directly into the gaping, jagged laceration on her left shoulder. White-hot agony exploded through her nervous system. Deborah's knees buckled. She gripped the edges of the sink so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. A strangled, guttural hiss escaping through her clenched teeth. The world tilted, her vision swimming with black spots. But she forced herself to stay upright. She watched the blood and alcohol wash down the rusty drain. Pain is just information, Luke used to tell her during their Sarah training. It just tells you you're still alive. She picked up the curved needle, threaded the thick nylon, and bit down hard on the rolled-up towel. The first stitch was the hardest, piercing her own skin, feeling the unnatural resistance of muscle and tissue. Required a specific kind of psychological detachment. She pushed the needle through the upper lip of the wound, dragged it across the gap, and pulled it tight. Blood welled up around the black thread. She tied it off, one down. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, but her hands were frighteningly steady. She moved with mechanical precision. Push, pull, tie, cut, push, pull, tie, cut. By the time she finished the 8th and final stitch, her left arm was numb, trembling with the aftershocks of trauma. She wiped the excess blood away, slapped a heavy waterproof dressing over the crude sutures, and spat the towel into the sink. When Deborah walked back out into the main garage, she was a different entity entirely. She had raided Marcus's personal locker. She wore dark gray tactical cargo pants, a black moisture-wicking combat shirt, and a lightweight, low-profile Kevlar vest. Over it all, she threw on a dark, tailored leather jacket to conceal the body armor. Marcus was waiting for her by the workbench. He had pushed aside Luke's lockbox to make room for his own private arsenal. "You can't just kick down the front door at Langley, Deb," Marcus said, his voice heavy with concern. Arthur Sterling is the deputy director of the CIA. He moves with a heavily armed security detail. He lives in a fortress. I know, Deborah said, walking over to the table. I'm not going after Sterling tonight. If I go near Langley, they'll vaporize me. She picked up the encrypted hard drive Luke had left behind. Luke said Sterling is running a shadow cartel, selling weapons-grade nerve agent. Deborah continued, her mind working at tactical speed. A deputy director doesn't physically move cash or product. He uses cutouts, bagmen, brokers. If this drive has the proof, it has the names of the people who handle his dirty work. She handed the drive to Marcus. Can you crack it? Marcus took the drive, examining the casing. Military-grade encryption. It's a localized air-gapped system. If I enter the wrong password 3 times, it triggers an internal thermite charge and melts the platters. He looked up at her. You have the password? Try IVY0814, she said without hesitation. Marcus plugged the drive into a ruggedized, offline laptop sitting on the corner of his workbench. A black command prompt screen popped up, demanding a decryption key. He typed in Ivy's name and birth date. Access denied. 2 attempts remaining. Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Deborah closed her eyes. Her mind raced back through the years. The codes, the inside jokes, the secure comms they used in the sandbox. If Luke wanted to make sure only she could open it, he would use a ghost from their past. A shared memory that didn't exist in any official CIA file. The porch light is flickering. Tell Ivy purple is my favorite color. Purple, Deborah whispered, her eyes snapping open. It's the burner protocol. Type Helmand Echo Purple. Marcus typed the phrase with agonizing slowness. He hit enter. The screen froze for 2 agonizing seconds. Then, a massive cascade of data began flooding the monitor. Offshore bank routing numbers, shipping manifests, encrypted email logs, and high-resolution photographs of illegal arms deals. We're in, Marcus muttered, his eyes wide as he scrolled through the damning evidence. Jesus, Deb, this is a billion-dollar pipeline. Sterling is selling VX nerve gas to rogue states. Find the money man, Deborah ordered, leaning over his shoulder. Who washes the cash on American soil? Marcus ran a quick search algorithm through the financial ledgers. Within 30 seconds, the system highlighted a recurring name linked to 12 different shell companies in the D.C. area. Julian Croft. Marcus read aloud, tapping the screen. He's a high-end lobbyist and political consultant, operating out of Georgetown. Officially, he throws fancy dinner parties for senators. Unofficially, according to Luke's data, he's the chief financial architect for Sterling's shadow ops. Where is he right now? Marcus typed furiously, cross-referencing public tax records and real estate holdings. He owns a 3-story brownstone on N Street in Georgetown. High-end security, but no government details. It's a private residence. Perfect, Deborah said softly. It was a terrifying sound. She turned back to the arsenal on the table. She ignored the heavy assault rifles, too loud, too impossible to conceal in the city. Instead, she picked up a custom Sig Sauer P226 Mk25, the standard issue for Navy SEALs. She checked the action, slammed a 15-round magazine of hollow-point ammunition into the grip, and holstered it on her right hip. She grabbed 2 spare magazines and slid them into her tactical belt. Next, She took a wicked-looking, fixed-blade karambit knife, sheathing it cleanly against her lower back. "Take the Audi," Marcus said, tossing a key fob across the table. Deborah caught it out of the air. It's an S8, dark blue, reinforced plating in the doors. Run flat tires. Engine is tuned to outrun anything local PD has. And the plates are scrubbed. It doesn't exist on any grid. You're a lifesaver, Grizzly, Deborah said, using his old call sign. She walked over to the dilapidated leather sofa. Ivy was still fast asleep, her breathing deep and even, completely unaware that her mother was marching off to war. Deborah knelt beside her, gently brushing a lock of hair from the little girl's forehead. "Mommy loves you, baby bird," she whispered into the quiet air. "More than anything." She stood up and looked at Marcus. "If I don't check in by 0600, you take her, you take the hard drive, you burn this shop to the ground, and you disappear. Canada, Mexico, I don't care. Just keep her safe. You're coming back, Deb," Marcus said firmly, crossing his massive arms. "You hear me? You owe that little girl a life." "I'm going to get her one," Deborah replied, her voice cold as steel. "Even if I have to step over Arthur Sterling's corpse to do it." Deborah turned and walked toward the sleek, dark Audi parked in the shadows of the garage. She hit the ignition. The powerful engine purred to life with a quiet, deadly menace. As the heavy steel garage door rattled open, letting in the damp, freezing air of the Virginia night, Deborah Fisher gripped the steering wheel. She was no longer running away. She pressed the gas pedal, the Audi launching out into the darkness, heading straight for the heart of Washington, D.C. Julian Croft was about to have a very bad night. The dark blue Audi S8 glided through the slick, cobblestone streets of Georgetown like a shark navigating a midnight reef. The torrential rain of Northern Virginia had softened into a persistent, freezing drizzle by the time Deborah crossed the Potomac River into Washington, D.C. Here, the violence of her world felt a million miles away. The neighborhood was a bastion of old money and quiet power. Gas lamps flickered warmly against the facades of multi-million-dollar historic brownstones, casting long, elegant shadows on the wet pavement. Deborah parked the Audi 2 blocks away from N Street, killing the engine. The silence inside the cabin was heavy. She unclipped her seatbelt, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid aggravating the fresh, agonizing sutures in her left shoulder. She did a final brass check on the Sig Sauer P226. Ensured the fixed-blade karambit was secure at her lower back, and pulled the collar of her dark leather jacket up against the biting wind. Stepping out into the freezing D.C. air, she became just another shadow. Julian Croft's residence was a towering, 4-story federal-style brick mansion at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. According to Luke's decrypted files, Croft was the architect of Deputy Director Sterling's shadow economy. He washed the blood money through offshore accounts and legitimate D.C. lobbying firms. Deborah approached the property from the narrow alleyway running behind the gardens. She didn't need to look for security cameras, she already knew where they were. Men like Croft bought expensive, off-the-shelf smart home security systems. Predictable, arrogant. She paused by the heavy wrought iron back gate, pulling a small, handheld frequency jammer from one of Marcus's tactical pouches. She clicked it on, for a radius of 50 feet. The 2.4 and 5 GHz Wi-Fi bands completely flatlined. The high-definition cloud cameras instantly went blind. Deborah scaled the brick perimeter wall with a fluid, silent grace, dropping into the manicured courtyard. She kept low, using the thick, dormant rose bushes for cover as she approached the rear entrance. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors, she could see into the opulent study. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a roaring fireplace. Walls lined with rare books. A massive mahogany desk. And there he was, Julian Croft. He was a man in his late 50s, sporting silver hair perfectly coiffed into a patrician wave. He wore a velvet smoking jacket, sitting in a plush leather armchair, swirling amber liquid in a crystal highball glass. He was typing leisurely on a sleek laptop, completely oblivious to the fact that his digital empire was burning, and the Grim Reaper was standing in his rose garden. Deborah bypassed the heavy glass doors. Shattering them would make too much noise. Instead, she moved to a side window leading into the darkened kitchen. Using a diamond-tipped glass cutter, she scored a perfect 4-inch circle near the latch, pressed a suction cup to the glass, and tapped it sharply. The circle popped out silently. She reached through, unlatched the window, and slipped inside. The house smelled of expensive cedar wood, aged scotch, and entitlement. Her wet boots made absolutely no sound on the imported marble floors as she moved through the dark kitchen and down the hallway toward the study. She drew the Sig Sauer, keeping the muzzle pointed at the floor, her finger resting safely outside the trigger guard. Croft was humming a classical tune, Bach, maybe, as he set his crystal glass down on a side table. Deborah stepped into the doorway of the study. She didn't announce herself. She simply stood there, letting the heavy, unnatural silence of the room alert him. It took Croft 10 seconds to realize he was no longer alone. He stopped typing. The humming died in his throat. He turned his head slowly, his eyes widening in absolute terror as they locked onto the muddy, blood-stained woman standing in his sanctuary. "Don't move," Deborah said. Her voice wasn't a yell. It was a terrifyingly calm, deadpan whisper. It was the voice of a professional who did this for a living. Croft's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted toward a small panic button installed under the lip of his mahogany desk. "The Wi-Fi is jammed. The hard lines are cut," Deborah stated, stepping fully into the room, raising the pistol just enough to let the firelight gleam off the black steel barrel. "If you press that button, nothing happens, except I put a 9mm hollow point through your kneecap. Stand up." Croft swallowed hard, the color completely draining from his face. He slowly raised his hands, his velvet jacket trembling. "Look, whatever you want. Cash, artwork. The safe is behind the painting. I'll give you the combination. Just don't hurt me. I don't want your money." "Julian," Deborah said, closing the distance between them. Croft blinked, confusion momentarily breaking through the panic. "Wait, how do you know my name? Who are you?" "I'm the widow of Army Ranger Luke Fisher," Deborah replied, her eyes boring into his soul like shards of glacial ice. The name hit Croft like a physical blow. He physically recoiled, collapsing backward into his leather armchair. No, that's impossible. Echo is dead. Sterling said the loose ends were tied up." "Sterling lied," Deborah said, stopping 2 feet in front of him. "He sent 3 cleaners to my house tonight. They missed. Now, I'm tying up the loose ends." She holstered her weapon in a single, fluid motion. Before Croft could even register that she was unarmed, Deborah's left hand shot out, grabbing him by the throat of his expensive velvet jacket and slamming him violently against the high back of the chair. Croft gasped, clawing helplessly at her grip. With her right hand, she drew the karambit knife from her lower back. The curved, wicked blade caught the light of the fire. She pressed the razor-sharp tip directly against the carotid artery on the side of his neck. A single drop of blood welled up under the steel. "Arthur Sterling," Deborah whispered, leaning in so close Croft could smell the rain and cordite on her clothes. "Where is he?" I don't know," Croft stammered, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "I just moved the money. I swear to God, he compartmentalizes everything." "Wrong answer." Deborah pressed the blade a fraction of a millimeter deeper. Wait, Croft shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "He's not at Langley. He's off the grid. There's a shipment coming in tomorrow night. The biggest one yet. Weapons-grade sarin gas. He's personally overseeing the transfer to a buyer." Deborah held the blade perfectly still. "Where?" "A defunct naval shipyard. In Baltimore. Pier 44. Croft was sobbing now, the dignified lobbyist completely broken by the reality of raw, unfiltered violence. "He's meeting the brokers there at midnight. Please, that's all I know. I swear." Deborah stared at him, analyzing his pupil dilation, his micro-expressions, the erratic thumping of his pulse against her blade. He was terrified. He was telling the truth. "You wash the money," Deborah said coldly. "Where is the physical ledger? The hard copy, not the encrypted files. I know a man like you keeps an insurance policy on a man like Sterling." Croft hesitated for a microsecond. It was all Deborah needed. She twisted her wrist, slamming the heavy steel ring of the karambit's hilt directly into Croft's jaw. The bone cracked with a sickening snap. Croft slumped over, groaning in agony, spitting blood onto his Persian rug. "The wall safe," Croft mumbled through a broken jaw, pointing a trembling finger toward a large oil painting of a horse. "Behind the canvas. The combination is 4198. Deborah kept her eyes on him as she backed up toward the painting. She tore the heavy frame off the wall, revealing a flush steel safe. She punched in the numbers. The heavy door clicked open. Inside sat a thick, leather-bound ledger and a stack of bearer bonds. She ignored the bonds and grabbed the ledger. Flipping through the pages, it was a gold mine. Dates, shipment manifests, offshore routing numbers, and Arthur Sterling's direct signature authorizing illegal transfers. It was the nail in the coffin. She shoved the ledger into the inside pocket of her jacket. Croft was clutching his jaw, looking up at her with terrified, pleading eyes. "You have what you want. You're going to kill me now, aren't you?" Deborah looked down at the pathetic, bleeding man. He was a monster in a custom suit. A man who profited off the slaughter of soldiers like her husband. She wanted to pull the trigger. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to end him. But Luke had given everything to pull her out of the darkness. She couldn't let Sterling drag her back into it. She wasn't an assassin. She was a mother trying to protect her child. "I'm not a cleaner, Julian," Deborah said, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. She walked over to his mahogany desk, picked up a heavy, antique bronze paperweight, and walked back to him. "But you're going to take a very long nap." Before Croft could react, Deborah brought the heavy bronze weight down in a sharp, calculated strike against his temple. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he slumped forward, completely unconscious. She quickly used his silk neckties to bind his wrists and ankles to the heavy oak legs of the desk. He wouldn't wake up for hours. By the time he did, his empire would be in ashes. Deborah walked back to the shattered window in the kitchen. She stepped out into the freezing DC night, the rain instantly washing the smell of expensive scotch and fear from her jacket. She had the location: Baltimore, Pier 44, midnight. Arthur Sterling was finally stepping out of the shadows, and Echo 2 was going to be waiting for him. The drive from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore was a blur of smeared neon lights and relentless driving rain. Deborah pushed the S8 to its limits, the twin-turbo V8 engine devouring the dark miles of I-95. Her physical body was failing. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the home invasion and the Georgetown interrogation was burning off, leaving a toxic residue of exhaustion. Her left shoulder throbbed with a sickly, hot rhythm, the crude nylon stitches pulling painfully tight against her skin with every shift of the steering wheel. But her mind was utterly, terrifyingly clear. By 11:15 p.m., she reached the industrial outskirts of Baltimore. Pier 44 was an iron graveyard. It was a decommissioned naval shipyard, a sprawling labyrinth of rusted shipping containers, decaying warehouses, and massive, skeletal gantry cranes that loomed against the stormy night sky like dormant steel giants. The air tasted of salt, diesel fuel, and old rust. Deborah parked the Audi a half-mile away, hidden inside the gutted shell of an abandoned fish packing plant. She popped the trunk. Marcus had packed light, but he had packed heavy hitters. She swapped the empty magazines in her Sig Sauer, checked the chamber of the suppressed MP7, and grabbed 2 block-shaped canvas pouches containing military-grade C4 plastic explosives with remote detonators. She slipped into the shadows, letting the freezing fog swallow her whole. Moving through the shipyard required absolute tactical precision. The rain masked the sound of her footsteps, but the puddles and scattered debris were treacherous. She navigated the maze of stacked shipping containers, sticking to the deepest shadows, her eyes constantly scanning the elevated walkways and rooftops. At 11:45 p.m., a convoy of 3 black, armored Chevy Suburbans rolled silently onto the pier, their headlights cutting through the thick fog. They parked in a tight, defensive triangle near the edge of the water, directly beneath a towering, rusted crane. Deborah scaled a stack of corrugated metal containers 50 yards away, crawling on her stomach across the wet, freezing roof to get a vantage point. She pulled a small thermal monocular from her tactical vest and pressed it to her eye. The thermal imaging cut through the fog. 12 hostile targets, highly trained. They moved in perfect synchronization, establishing a 360-degree perimeter around the vehicles. They were carrying customized assault rifles equipped with advanced optics and suppressors. These weren't street thugs. This was Sterling's private Praetorian Guard. Elite mercenaries, likely ex-special forces operating entirely off the grid. A fourth vehicle, a heavy, unmarked transport truck, rumbled onto the pier a few minutes later, parking next to the Suburbans. The door of the center SUV opened. Even through the green, pixelated lens of the thermal scope, Deborah instantly recognized the tall, imposing silhouette stepping out into the rain. Deputy Director Arthur Sterling. He wore a heavy wool trench coat, holding a black umbrella over his head, looking completely unbothered by the miserable weather or the illegal treason he was about to commit. Two men emerged from the transport truck. The buyers, foreign brokers, heavily bundled against the cold. Sterling motioned to the back of the first SUV. Two mercenaries opened the heavy rear doors and hauled out two sleek, silver cylindrical cases, weapons-grade sarin gas, enough to wipe out a mid-sized city, packaged neatly in custom foam. Deborah lowered the monocular. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A cold, calculated fury replacing the pain in her shoulder. Sterling was right there. The man who ordered her husband's execution. The man who sent killers into her daughter's bedroom. She couldn't take on 12 elite operators in a straight firefight. She needed chaos. She needed to turn their overwhelming numbers against them. She slid backward, dropping silently from the container into the narrow alleyway below. She moved like a ghost through the rusted labyrinth, flanking the perimeter. She found her first target at the edge of the pier. A lone sniper posted on a catwalk overlooking the water. Deborah climbed the rusted ladder, her boots making no sound over the crashing waves. She crept up behind him, clamped her hand over his mouth, and drove the karambit blade upward, perfectly severing his brainstem. He died instantly, without a single sound. She lowered his body to the grated floor, unclipped his radio, and attached it to her own tactical vest. She needed to monitor their comms. Moving with lethal efficiency, she planted the first block of C4 onto the main fuel tank of the foreign broker's transport truck. She planted the second block on a massive, rusted structural support beam of a nearby decaying warehouse, directly adjacent to Sterling's defensive perimeter. 11:58 p.m. The transfer was almost complete. The buyers were handing over a heavy aluminum briefcase, the payment. Deborah retreated to the high ground on top of the shipping containers. Drawing the suppressed MP7, she took a deep breath, the freezing rain mixing with the sweat on her face. She pulled the remote detonator from her pocket. For Luke, she whispered to the storm. She thumbed the trigger. The twin explosions tore the night apart. The C4 on the transport truck ignited the fuel lines, creating a massive, blinding fireball that completely engulfed the buyers and two of Sterling's mercenaries. A split second later, the structural beam of the warehouse shattered. Thousands of pounds of brick, rusted steel, and corrugated roofing collapsed outward with a deafening roar, crushing one of the armored Suburbans and burying three more guards under tons of debris. Contact! Contact! We are under attack! The stolen radio on Deborah's vest screamed. The secure channel erupting into absolute panic. The pristine, disciplined perimeter instantly dissolved into hellish chaos. The surviving mercenaries blindly returned fire into the fog, shooting at shadows, their muzzle flashes illuminating the swirling smoke and rain. Sterling was shoved to the ground by his personal detail, screaming orders that were drowned out by the roaring flames. This was Deborah's element, the fog of war. She dropped from the container, landing lightly behind a mercenary who was frantically scanning the rooftops. She fired a 3-round burst from the MP7 directly into the back of his Kevlar helmet. He crumpled instantly. She didn't stop moving. Speed was her only armor now. She vaulted over a concrete barricade, sliding across the wet, oily pavement, and opened fire on two more guards trying to secure the sarin gas canisters. Her hollow-point rounds shredded their lower legs, bypassing their heavy body armor, and as they fell, she finished them with clinical headshots. "Where is it coming from? I have no visual," a voice shrieked over the comms. Hold the package. Protect the director, the team leader roared. Deborah slammed a fresh magazine into the MP7. There were only 4 mercenaries left, huddled tightly around Arthur Sterling behind the last intact SUV. The silver canisters of sarin were sitting on the ground, inches from Sterling's boots. She was 30 yards away. The flames from the burning truck cast long, demonic shadows across the pier. She stepped out from the cover of the shipping containers, walking slowly, deliberately into the flickering orange light. She raised the submachine gun, leveling the sights dead center on the group. Sterling. Deborah's voice cut through the crackling flames and the torrential rain. It wasn't a yell. It was a terrifying, resonant command that commanded absolute silence. Arthur Sterling peeked over the hood of the SUV. The color drained from his patrician face as he stared at the lone, blood-soaked woman standing in the rain. "Fisher?" Sterling gasped, absolute disbelief shattering his composed facade. You're supposed to be dead." "I was," Deborah said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "But I got better." The 4 remaining mercenaries instantly pivoted, raising their assault rifles, their laser sights converging on Deborah's chest. She had the drop on them, but she couldn't shoot all 4 before they riddled her with bullets. It was a Mexican standoff. "Stand down, don't shoot her." Sterling suddenly panicked. Holding his hands up, he reached down and violently grabbed one of the silver sarin canisters. Holding it in front of his chest like a shield, his hand hovered over a small keypad on the canister's lid. "Back off, Echo!" Sterling yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "You know what this is. The pressure seal is tied to a dead man's switch. You shoot me, I drop this. The seal breaks. And the gas vents. We all die right here. The wind will carry it straight into downtown Baltimore." Deborah froze. The crosshairs of her MP7 were locked onto Sterling's forehead. But the threat was real. Weapons-grade sarin. Odorless. Invisible. A single breath would cause convulsions, paralysis, and death within minutes. The mercenaries kept their weapons trained on her, waiting for the order to fire. The rain hissed violently against the burning wreckage around them. "You've lost, Deborah," Sterling sneered, slowly regaining his arrogant composure. "Luke is a ghost. You're a wanted domestic terrorist who just blew up a federal port. Drop the weapon. Maybe I'll let you live long enough to say goodbye to your daughter." Mentioning Ivy was his final, fatal mistake. Deborah didn't lower the gun. Her icy blue eyes locked onto Sterling, a terrifying, predatory calm washing over her. She knew the technical specs of those canisters. Luke had taught her. She knew Sterling was bluffing about the dead man's switch. The failsafe was mechanical, not digital. But before Deborah could pull the trigger, a sound echoed from the darkness behind Sterling. A sharp, metallic clack, the unmistakable sound of a heavy sniper rifle bolt locking into place. From the dense, swirling fog atop the rusted gantry crane directly above them, a deep, raspy voice echoed through a heavy megaphone. "You always were a terrible liar, Arthur." Sterling froze, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he looked up toward the crane. The mercenaries scrambled, aiming their weapons frantically up at the fog, unable to see the shooter. Deborah felt the breath leave her lungs. The weapon dropped an inch. Her heart stopped completely. She knew that voice. It was a voice that had been buried under the sands of Helmand Province 5 years ago. "Luke." The voice rolling out of the thick Baltimore fog hit Deborah like a physical shockwave. The MP7 in her hands trembled for a fraction of a second. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics and reality. But the deep, raspy cadence, the way it cut through the torrential rain, was a sound embedded in her very DNA. Arthur Sterling's eyes darted frantically toward the rusted gantry crane towering 100 feet above them in the darkness. Fisher? No. I saw the after-action report. I saw the DNA confirmation. You saw what I wanted you to see. Arthur. The voice boomed from the megaphone, echoing off the wet metal of the shipping containers. The 4 remaining mercenaries didn't wait for orders. They broke formation, raising their thermal-equipped rifles toward the crane, completely exposing their flanks. It was a fatal tactical error. A deafening, thunderous crack ripped through the night, easily overpowering the roar of the burning transport truck. It was the distinct, bone-rattling signature of a suppressed .338 Lapua Magnum sniper rifle. The mercenary standing closest to Sterling didn't even have time to scream. The massive armor-piercing round hit him dead center in the chest, lifting him clean off his feet and throwing him backward into the side of the armored SUV. He was dead before he hit the pavement. In that exact microsecond, the shock paralyzing Deborah vanished. 5 years of grief, trauma, and civilian life evaporated. She wasn't just a mother protecting her child anymore, she was Echo too. And her Overwatch was finally back online. She dropped to her knees, sliding across the wet, oily asphalt as the 3 remaining mercenaries panicked, caught in a deadly crossfire. Without needing to communicate, without a single word passed between them, the husband and wife kill team executed a flawless pincer movement. Crack! A second sniper round descended from the fog, obliterating the rifle of a mercenary pivoting toward Deborah, tearing his arm apart in a spray of crimson. Before he could fall, Deborah fired a precise 3-round burst from her MP7, taking him out of the equation. Left flank. Moving, Deborah shouted, her voice pure, lethal adrenaline. She vaulted over a stack of wooden pallets, using the flickering firelight to track the last 2 guards. They were blindly spraying suppressive fire toward the top of the crane, the muzzle flashes illuminating their desperate, terrified faces. Deborah flanked them from the blind side, switching her submachine gun to single fire. Pop, pop. 2 hollow point rounds found the unarmored gaps at the base of their skulls. They dropped simultaneously, hitting the flooded pier with a heavy splash. Silence descended on Pier 44, broken only by the relentless hiss of the freezing rain and the crackle of the burning wreckage. Arthur Sterling was entirely alone. The deputy director of the CIA, a man who commanded drone strikes and toppled foreign governments, was huddled on his hands and knees in the muddy, freezing water. He was desperately crawling toward the front of the SUV, entirely abandoning the 2 silver sarin gas canisters sitting in the puddles behind him. Deborah stepped out from the shadows, her weapon lowered but ready. Her chest heaved, her breath coming in ragged white clouds. She looked up at the massive gantry crane. From the rusted catwalk, a dark silhouette detached itself from the shadows. A heavy black tactical rope uncoiled, dropping into the light of the fires. A second later, a man fast roped down, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy, deliberate thud. He stood up slowly. He wore a heavily modified ghillie suit suited for urban environments, plastered with mud and ash. In his hands, he held a massive, bolt-action sniper rifle. He pulled off his wet tactical mask and dropped it to the ground. Deborah stopped breathing. His face was scarred, deeply lined with exhaustion, and weathered by 5 years of living as a hunted ghost in the harshest corners of the globe. His dark hair was overgrown and soaked with rain. But the eyes, those steady, fiercely protective brown eyes, were exactly as she remembered them. Luke Fisher stared at his wife. The lethal sniper who had just neutralized a squad of elite mercenaries looked entirely vulnerable. His jaw trembled. "Deb," Luke choked out, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of the swagger he'd used over the megaphone. He took a hesitant step toward her, as if afraid she was a mirage that the storm would wash away. Deborah let the MP7 slip from her fingers. It clattered against the asphalt. She didn't walk, she sprinted. She slammed into him, burying her face into his wet, heavy tactical vest, her arms wrapping around his neck with a desperate, crushing force. Luke dropped his sniper rifle, wrapping his massive arms around her, burying his face in her wet hair. He pulled her so tight it hurt her wounded shoulder. But she didn't care. She clung to him, sobbing violently, letting 5 years of agonizing, suffocating grief pour out into the freezing Baltimore rain. "I've got you," Luke whispered repeatedly, his tears mixing with the storm. "I'm here. I'm right here. My love, I'm never leaving again." They stood there in the ruins of the shipyard, the fire raging around them. Two halves of a shattered soul finally sliding back into place. But the war wasn't over. A pathetic, wet coughing sound broke the moment. Deborah and Luke separated, keeping their hands intertwined. They turned to see Arthur Sterling trying to pull himself up using the bumper of the SUV. The arrogant spymaster was trembling violently, soaked to the bone, his expensive wool coat ruined. Luke's eyes hardened into dark steel. He reached down to his thigh holster, drawing a heavy .45 caliber 1911 pistol. He walked slowly toward Sterling, the predator approaching its crippled prey. "Fisher, wait," Sterling wheezed, holding up a trembling hand, pressing his back against the grill of the truck. "Think about what you're doing. You kill a deputy director. You will never stop running. They will hunt you, your wife, and your daughter to the ends of the earth." "They already did, Arthur," Luke said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He stopped 3 feet away, aiming the heavy barrel directly at the bridge of Sterling's nose. "You sent cleaners into my little girl's bedroom tonight. You crossed the line. I have money. I have offshore accounts," Sterling babbled, absolute panic stripping away his dignity. "I can give you new identities. A clean slate. Whatever you want. Just name the price." Deborah walked up to stand beside her husband. She reached into the inside pocket of her leather jacket and pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledger she had taken from Julian Croft's safe in Georgetown. She tossed it into the deep, muddy puddle right at Sterling's feet. It landed with a heavy, final splash. Sterling stared down at the ledger. All the color drained from his face. He knew exactly what it was. It was his death warrant. "We don't need your money," Deborah said, her voice dripping with glacial contempt. "And we aren't going to kill you, Arthur." Luke didn't lower his weapon. "Shooting you is too easy. It's what you deserve, but it lets you off the hook. You get to die a martyr for the agency." In the distance, over the sound of the crashing waves, a new noise pierced the night. Sirens, dozens of them. The massive explosions had triggered a massive response. The Baltimore PD, SWAT, and the FBI were converging on Pier 44. "We made a phone call before we lit up your convoy," Luke explained, a cold, Ruthless smile touching the corners of his mouth. The FBI has Julian Croft in custody right now. And in about 3 minutes, the feds are going to swarm this pier. They're going to find a burned-out truck full of foreign brokers, 2 canisters of weapons-grade sarin gas, and the deputy director of the CIA standing over a ledger detailing his billion-dollar treason. Sterling looked around frantically, listening to the approaching sirens. No, they'll lock me in a black site. I'll never see daylight again. You can't do this. Watch us, Deborah said. She drew her Sig Sauer P226, aiming down at Sterling's legs. Without a single blink of hesitation, she pulled the trigger twice. Bang, bang. Sterling shrieked in agony as 2 9mm hollow point rounds shattered his kneecaps. He collapsed face first into the muddy, freezing water, clutching his legs, screaming as his blood pooled around the sarin gas canisters. That was for the 5 years you stole from me, Deborah whispered coldly. She turned to Luke. He looked at her, a profound mixture of awe, love, and terrifying respect in his eyes. Let's go home, Luke said, holstering his weapon. We need to get Ivy first, Deborah replied, picking up her MP7. She's with Marcus. Luke's face softened at the mention of his daughter's name. Is she okay? Did she grow? She has your stubborn chin. Deborah smiled, a real, genuine smile breaking through the grime and blood on her face. Come on, I'll tell you all about it on the way. The sirens were deafening now, the flashing red and blue lights breaking through the thick fog at the entrance of the shipyard. Luke grabbed the black tactical rope attached to his harness, wrapping an arm tightly around his wife's waist. He hit a mechanized retractor on his belt, and the high-tensile wire zipped upward, pulling them both rapidly into the dark, concealing fog above the gantry crane, leaving Arthur Sterling screaming in the ruins of his empire. The ghosts had vanished back into the shadows. Only this time, they were together. The storm finally broke just as the first bruised light of dawn began to bleed across the Virginia skyline. The relentless freezing rain had softened into a quiet, cleansing mist. The dark blue Audi S8 pulled into the narrow, unlit alleyway in Alexandria, its tires crunching softly against the wet gravel. It stopped in front of the unmarked corrugated steel door of Marcus's auto shop. Inside the cabin, Deborah sat in the driver's seat. She killed the engine, the sudden silence heavy and profound. Beside her, in the passenger seat, sat a ghost. Luke Fisher stared at the rusted steel door of the garage. For 5 years, he had operated in the darkest, most unforgiving corners of the earth. He had survived firefights in Damascus, evaded drone strikes in Yemen, and slept with a loaded pistol in his hand every single night. But sitting here, 10 feet away from his daughter, the legendary Tier 1 operator was trembling. He looked down at his hands. They were scarred, rough, and stained with the grime of the shipyard. I don't know how to do this, Deb, Luke whispered, his voice incredibly fragile. I left her when she was 1 year old. She doesn't know me. What if she's scared of me? Deborah reached across the center console. She didn't care about the agonizing pull of the stitches in her left shoulder. She took his large, trembling hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. Her own hands were just as scarred, just as bruised. She knows you, Luke, Deborah said softly, her icy blue eyes warm and brimming with unshed tears. I talked to her about you every single day. You're not a stranger. You're her hero. She squeezed his hand, a silent, anchoring promise. Let's go get our baby bird. They stepped out of the Audi into the cool morning air. Deborah walked to the keypad beside the garage and punched in a 6-digit code. The heavy steel door rattled and began to slowly rise. Inside, the massive shop was completely dark, save for the single work lamp illuminating the back corner. As soon as the door cleared 3 feet, a massive shadow detached itself from the wall. Marcus stepped into the dim light, a heavy tactical shotgun raised and locked tightly into his shoulder. His finger was indexed on the trigger, his eyes scanning the breech. He saw Deborah first. He lowered the barrel of the shotgun an inch, letting out a heavy breath. And then, he saw the tall, broad-shouldered man standing right behind her. Marcus froze. The heavy shotgun slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. The giant mechanic, a man who had walked through the fires of Fallujah without flinching, lost all the color in his face. Echo? Marcus choked out, his voice cracking into a raw, disbelieving whisper. Luke stepped forward into the light. He offered a weak, exhausted smile. You kept the box safe. Grizzly, I owe you a beer. Marcus didn't say a word. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides and wrapped his arms around Luke in a crushing, desperate bear hug. The 2 combat veterans held onto each other, the weight of a 5-year-old grief finally lifting off their shoulders. Marcus buried his face in Luke's shoulder, a single, heavy sob escaping the giant man's chest. You crazy son of a bitch. Marcus laughed wetly, pulling back and gripping Luke by the shoulders. I buried an empty box. I know, brother, I know. Luke smiled, clapping a hand on Marcus's neck. But I'm back. I'm done running. Deborah walked past them, her heart pulling her toward the dilapidated leather sofa in the corner. Ivy was just beginning to stir. The heavy wool blanket had slipped down her shoulder. She was clutching her stuffed golden retriever, her small nose twitching as she woke up to the smell of old motor oil and cheap coffee. Deborah knelt softly beside the couch. Hey, baby bird, she whispered, gently brushing a lock of hair from Ivy's sleepy eyes. Time to wake up. Ivy blinked, rubbing her eyes with a tiny fist. Mommy, are the bad men gone? They're gone, sweetie. Deborah smiled, her voice thick with emotion. They're never coming back, and somebody is here to see you. Deborah stood up and took a step back. Luke walked slowly toward the sofa. He took off his heavy tactical vest, dropping it to the floor. He wanted nothing dangerous, nothing sharp. Between him and his little girl, he dropped to his knees on the cold concrete, bringing himself down to her eye level. Ivy sat up slowly. She clutched her stuffed dog tighter, staring at the strange, scarred man kneeling in front of her. Her big, blue eyes, an exact mirror of her mother's, were wide with curiosity. But not fear. Luke's chest heaved, tears spilled over his eyelashes, tracking down through the dirt and soot on his cheeks. He couldn't speak, he just looked at her, absorbing the miracle of her existence. Are you? Ivy started, her voice a tiny, bird-like whisper. She looked at his nose, his stubborn chin, and the crooked smile that was currently fighting its way through his tears. She reached into the pocket of her oversized fleece jacket. She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, the drawing she had made at the kitchen table yesterday afternoon. A crude crayon drawing of a man with purple hair. She held it out to him. Mommy said your favorite color is purple. Luke let out a watery, broken laugh. He reached out with a trembling hand and gently took the paper. He looked at the drawing, and then back at the little girl who had anchored his soul to the world for half a decade. "It is," Luke whispered, his voice incredibly gentle. "It's the most beautiful color in the world." Ivy looked at him for a long moment. Then, she let go of her stuffed dog. She slid off the leather sofa and stepped directly into his arms. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered. Luke let out a gut-wrenching sob, wrapping his arms around her tiny body. Burying his face in the crook of her neck, he held her like a man grasping onto a lifeline in the middle of a hurricane. Deborah watched them, leaning her head against Marcus's massive arm. Tears streamed freely down her face. But for the first time in 5 years, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of absolute, unfiltered joy. The nightmare was over. 3 months later, the sun beat down brightly on the crystal-clear waters of the Caribbean Sea. A gentle, salty breeze blew across the wooden deck of a secluded beach house on the coast of Costa Rica. Inside the airy living room, a small flat-screen TV played an international news channel at a low volume. The federal trial of disgraced CIA Deputy Director Arthur Sterling begins next week. The news anchor reported, a graphic of Sterling's mugshot flashing on the screen. Sterling, who was discovered by the FBI on a Baltimore pier with 2 canisters of nerve agent and a detailed financial ledger, faces multiple counts of high treason and domestic terrorism. The Justice Department is seeking life without parole. A remote control clicked, turning the television off. Deborah Fisher tossed the remote onto the rattan coffee table. She wore a simple white sundress, her bare feet resting on the cool hardwood floor. Her skin had lost its pale, haunted pallor, replaced by a healthy, golden tan. The scar on her left shoulder was healing nicely, a permanent reminder, but no longer a source of pain. She walked out onto the sun-drenched deck. Down on the pristine white sand, Luke was running, laughing loudly as a 6-year-old girl chased him with a bright green plastic water gun. Ivy shrieked with delight, firing a stream of water that caught her father squarely in the chest. Luke dramatically clutched his heart, tumbling backward into the shallow, turquoise waves with a massive splash. Ivy erupted into a fit of giggles, splashing into the water after him, throwing her arms around his neck. Deborah leaned against the wooden railing of the deck, sipping a cup of black coffee. She smiled, watching her husband surface, lifting their daughter high into the air against the backdrop of a cloudless blue sky. They had a new name. They had a new country. They had a new life. But as Deborah took a sip of her coffee, her icy blue eyes instinctively scanned the perimeter of the beach. She noted the heavy tree line to the west, the single dirt road leading to the property, and the clear lines of sight from the water. Old habits died hard. A good soldier never completely lets their guard down. But as she looked back at her family, bathed in the warm, healing sunlight, she knew one thing for certain. The ghosts of Helmand were finally laid to rest, and the widow had finally come back to life.